For 21 years, nobody questioned why the dam operator knew every structural detail by memory, why he ran security drills nobody asked for, why he kept demolition equipment in his maintenance room. The terrorists were about to find out why. Welcome to Faces Behind Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden expertise in explosive prevention, tell me in the comments from which city are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us honor the silent guardians who protect our most vital infrastructure. Hoover Dam had a smaller but equally critical cousin in the Colorado Rockies. The Blackwater Dam stretched 420 feet across the mountain valley, holding back 2.3 million acre-feet of water that supplied drinking water, irrigation, and hydroelectric power to Denver, Colorado Springs, and Pueblo, a combined population of nearly 3 million people. Built in 1967 as part of the Colorado River Project, it was both an engineering marvel and a potential catastrophe waiting for the wrong hands to trigger it. For 21 years, Marcus Webb had been the dam's senior operations engineer. Working the day shift from 5 a.m. to 5 p.m. 6 days a week, he maintained the complex systems that controlled water flow, power generation, and structural integrity for one of Colorado's most important pieces of infrastructure. At 58, he was the kind of employee the Army Corps of Engineers valued most: experienced, dedicated, and completely familiar with every bolt, valve, and sensor in the massive concrete structure. Most of the dam personnel knew Marcus as a methodical professional who approached his work with almost military precision. He conducted daily inspections that went far beyond standard requirements, maintained detailed logs of every system parameter, and had an encyclopedic knowledge of the dam's engineering specifications, maintenance history, and emergency protocols. "Marcus knows this dam like he built it himself," said Linda Chen, the facility supervisor who'd worked with Marcus for 14 years. "I swear he can hear when something's wrong just by the way the turbines sound or how the concrete responds to pressure changes." "More than that," added Jim Rodriguez, a maintenance technician who'd been on the dam crew for 9 years. "Guy runs emergency drills that aren't even in our procedures manual. Flood scenarios, structural failure assessments, even security protocols that seem way beyond what we'd ever need. My wife jokes that he treats this place like it's a military installation. Last month, he made us practice evacuation procedures for scenarios I'd never even heard of, like coordinated attacks on multiple infrastructure points. But there were things about Marcus Webb that didn't quite add up, if you knew what to look for. His daily inspections followed patterns designed to detect potential sabotage and structural vulnerabilities, not just routine maintenance issues. His office contained technical manuals and engineering references that went far beyond civilian dam operations, including military engineering texts and demolition guides that seemed unusual for standard hydroelectric work. Most telling of all, Marcus kept a secured equipment locker in his maintenance area that contained tools and devices that appeared more suited for combat engineering than dam maintenance. The Department of Homeland Security had noticed Marcus's unusual competence during post-9/11 critical infrastructure assessments. When federal agents had conducted vulnerability studies of major dams, Marcus had identified potential attack vectors and structural weaknesses that impressed counterterrorism engineers. His recommendations for enhanced security measures had been adopted as standard protocols for similar facilities throughout the region. During the one serious incident the dam had experienced, a seismic event that had threatened structural integrity, Marcus had responded with crisis management skills that seemed to exceed what civilian engineering training would provide. He'd coordinated emergency responses using technical language and tactical thinking that suggested extensive military background, even directing helicopter evacuations and establishing command protocols that impressed emergency responders. "Guy thinks like a combat engineer," muttered Agent David Park of the FBI's Infrastructure Protection Unit, who'd worked with Marcus during a credible threat assessment 2 years earlier. "Sometimes I think he understands structural vulnerabilities better than our own demolition experts." What Agent Park didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Marcus Webb had spent 24 years in the Army, including 16 years as a Corps of Engineers officer specializing in dam construction, demolition, and protection operations, plus 8 years with Special Forces as an engineering specialist. He had been part of teams that built critical infrastructure in hostile environments and developed countermeasures against enemies who used civilian structures as strategic targets. Marcus's specialty had been hydraulic engineering and structural demolition analysis. He'd spent years learning to design dams that could withstand both natural disasters and deliberate attacks, understanding how water pressure, concrete stress, and explosive placement could be used to create either protective barriers or devastating weapons. His final deployment had been to Afghanistan, where he'd spent 22 months protecting and rebuilding infrastructure that insurgents repeatedly targeted for maximum civilian impact. That deployment had ended with an operation that still shaped how Marcus viewed his civilian responsibilities. Taliban forces had attempted to destroy a dam that provided water and power to over 400,000 Afghan civilians. Marcus's team had discovered the plot through structural analysis that revealed suspicious modifications to the dam's foundation, but stopping the attack had required both engineering expertise and combat skills that pushed the limits of conventional military training. Two of his engineers hadn't made it home from that mission, a loss that drove Marcus to ensure no civilian infrastructure under his protection would ever face a similar fate. Marcus had left the Army in 2002 with an honorable discharge, a distinguished service cross he'd never displayed, and skills that translated perfectly to civilian dam operations. The Blackwater Dam position had been ideal. It allowed him to use his hydraulic engineering expertise in a peaceful environment while protecting the kind of critical infrastructure he'd spent his military career defending overseas. For 21 years, he'd found purpose in the rhythm of dam operations, treating each shift like a mission that required constant vigilance and technical excellence. His dam was his area of responsibility, and he protected it with the same dedication he'd once brought to military engineering operations in combat zones. But on a Wednesday morning in August, Marcus's two worlds collided in the most dangerous way possible. It was 6:23 a.m. when he noticed them. Marcus was conducting his routine structural inspection when his trained eye caught something that made his blood run cold: fresh concrete dust near one of the dam's critical support buttresses and traces of what looked like drilling residue in patterns that suggested deliberate modification rather than routine maintenance. Someone had been placing explosive charges in his dam's foundation. Marcus's mind shifted into a mode he thought he'd left behind 21 years ago. Structural threat assessment, demolition analysis, hydraulic failure prediction. The quiet dam operator was disappearing, replaced by the Army Corps engineer who'd once prevented the catastrophic destruction of civilian infrastructure in some of the world's most dangerous places. He activated the secure communication system he'd installed years earlier, an unofficial upgrade that connected directly to FBI and Army Corps emergency frequencies, and began transmitting coded assessments while he conducted a more detailed investigation of what he'd discovered. What Marcus found made him realize that this wasn't just terrorism. It was a precisely planned operation designed to create the worst man-made flood disaster in American history. 6 explosive devices had been placed at critical structural points throughout the dam's foundation and spillway systems. The charges were sophisticated enough to require professional demolition expertise, positioned to create a catastrophic failure that would send 2.3 million acre-feet of water rushing down the valley toward 3 major cities. But Marcus also recognized something that the saboteurs hadn't counted on. Their placement patterns followed theoretical demolition models he'd studied in military engineering courses, which meant he could predict the sequence of detonation and potentially counteract their plan using the dam's own structural systems. Marcus reached for his emergency phone to call the FBI, then stopped. The timer mechanisms he'd identified showed less than 20 minutes until detonation, and the nearest bomb disposal team was over an hour away. By the time help arrived, downtown Denver would be underwater. Time to act. Marcus opened the secure equipment locker he'd maintained in the dam's engineering center, disguised as specialized maintenance tools but containing equipment he'd hoped never to need again: military-grade detection devices, structural analysis instruments, and a collection of engineering tools that had been selected for their dual-purpose potential in protecting critical infrastructure. But as Marcus prepared to begin his countermeasures, he heard voices echoing through the dam's interior corridors. The saboteurs hadn't just planted their explosives and left, they were still in the facility, probably to ensure their plan succeeded and to prevent exactly the kind of intervention Marcus was attempting. 6 terrorists, unknown additional weapons, nearly 3 million civilians downstream, multiple sophisticated explosive devices with active timers. It was exactly the kind of infrastructure defense scenario he'd trained for his entire military career. Marcus slipped into the network of maintenance tunnels and access passages that honeycombed the dam's massive concrete structure, moving through areas that were invisible to casual observers, but as familiar to him as his own home. 21 years of daily operations had taught him every corridor, every equipment room, every tactical advantage that could be exploited in defending his facility. The first terrorist never saw him coming. The man was positioned near the dam's main turbine hall, using his rifle to prevent anyone from approaching the explosive devices while his partners maintained security positions throughout the facility. Marcus emerged from a ventilation access directly above him, moving with the controlled precision that had once made him an effective Special Forces engineer. A heavy wrench became a weapon, and the terrorist was unconscious and zip-tied before he could raise an alarm. 1 down, 5 to go. But Marcus's real advantage wasn't superior training, it was superior knowledge. He knew every system, every pressure point, every structural element that these terrorists were trying to destroy. He understood how their explosives worked, where they'd be most vulnerable to countermeasures, and how to use the dam's own engineering systems as defensive tools. The second terrorist was neutralized when Marcus used the dam's flood control systems to create a sudden water release that masked his approach through the spillway access tunnels. The man was focused on the timer mechanism when Marcus appeared behind him like a ghost emerging from the concrete itself. The third and fourth went down when Marcus activated the dam's emergency lighting system, while simultaneously releasing high-pressure steam from the power generation systems, creating enough chaos and confusion to allow for rapid, silent takedowns. That left 2 terrorists and 6 active explosive devices with less than 12 minutes until detonation. Marcus found the remaining saboteurs in the dam's control room, where they were monitoring their explosive network and preparing for what they believed would be the most devastating act of domestic terrorism in American history. They were young, maybe mid-20s, with the focused intensity of people who believed they were about to change the world through destruction. "Step away from the controls," Marcus said quietly, emerging from behind the main computer console with his hands visible but ready. "You don't understand what you're about to unleash." The terrorists spun toward him, automatic weapons rising, but Marcus was already moving. 21 years of civilian life hadn't dulled reflexes honed in Afghanistan's most dangerous engineering operations. Both men found themselves disarmed and restrained before they fully understood what had happened. But neutralizing the terrorists was only the beginning. Marcus still had 6 sophisticated explosive devices to deal with in less than 10 minutes, and each one required the kind of precise structural analysis that couldn't be rushed without triggering a catastrophic dam failure. However, Marcus had one advantage that the saboteurs hadn't anticipated. As the dam's senior engineer, he understood not just how to destroy the structure, but how to save it. Instead of attempting to disarm each device individually, an impossible task given the time constraints, he could use the dam's own systems to counteract the explosive effects. Marcus raced to the main control panel and began implementing an emergency protocol he'd developed years earlier, but never thought he'd need to use. By rapidly adjusting water levels, redirecting pressure flows, and reinforcing critical structural points through the dam's built-in engineering systems, he could potentially contain the explosive damage and prevent catastrophic failure. Working with the systematic precision that had once saved civilian infrastructure in Afghanistan, Marcus manipulated water pressure, concrete stress distribution, and structural load patterns to create a defensive configuration that would absorb and redirect the explosive forces rather than allowing them to propagate through the dam's foundation. With 3 minutes and 17 seconds remaining on the terrorist timers, Marcus completed his emergency reconfiguration and activated the dam's crisis management protocols. The explosions came exactly on schedule, but instead of destroying the dam, they were absorbed and dissipated by the structural modifications Marcus had implemented. The Blackwater Dam shuddered, groaned, and held. 3 million people downstream never knew how close they'd come to disaster. When FBI agents and Army Corps engineers arrived 40 minutes later, they found 6 sophisticated explosive devices that had detonated harmlessly, 6 unconscious terrorists ready for transport, and a dam operator calmly conducting post-incident structural assessments as if nothing unusual had happened. The questions came immediately and extensively. Who was he? How had he known what to do? Where had he learned to counter advanced demolition techniques using dam operation systems? Marcus answered them with the same quiet professionalism he'd brought to 21 years of dam operations. Yes, he'd served in the Army Corps of Engineers. Yes, he'd been trained for situations involving critical infrastructure protection. No, he didn't consider himself a hero. He'd just done what needed to be done to protect the infrastructure and people who depended on it. But the investigation revealed more than Marcus had wanted known. Military records that had been classified for years suddenly became relevant to a federal terrorism case. His service as an Army Corps officer and Special Forces engineer, his deployments to combat zones, his specialized training in infrastructure protection and counter-demolition operations. It all came out in the reports and witness statements. The photo in the dam's operations office, the one showing 21 years of safety awards and engineering excellence, suddenly took on new meaning. That quiet operator in the background of every facility photo wasn't just Marcus the dam engineer. He was Colonel Webb, decorated combat veteran, a warrior who'd spent 21 years quietly protecting one of Colorado's most vital pieces of infrastructure. When Marcus returned to work a week later, everything had changed. Dam personnel who'd worked alongside him for years now looked at him with new respect and understanding. Army Corps officials who'd supervised him for over 2 decades realized they'd had a legend operating in plain sight. The Department of Homeland Security sent a delegation to meet the man who'd single-handedly prevented what could have been the worst infrastructure disaster in American history. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" asked Linda Chen as they stood on the dam's observation deck, looking out at the peaceful reservoir that had almost become a weapon of mass destruction. Marcus was quiet for a moment, watching the controlled water release that provided life and power to millions of people downstream. "Some things are better left in the past," he said finally. "I came here to operate a dam, not to fight wars. But you saved 3 million lives." "I protected my dam," Marcus replied simply. "Same thing I've been doing for 21 years, just more obvious this time." The Blackwater Dam resumed normal operations the next day with enhanced security measures and a small memorial plaque near the control room where the incident had taken place. It didn't mention Marcus by name. He'd specifically requested that it not, but simply read, "In honor of those who stand watch over the waters that sustain our communities." Marcus Webb continued his daily operations, conducting the same meticulous inspections and maintaining the same quiet professionalism he'd always shown. But now people knew who he really was and what he'd been willing to do to keep them safe. The American flag that flew from the dam's highest point didn't carry his name either. But everyone who saw it knew exactly who it honored and why a simple concrete structure had become a symbol of the hidden heroes who protect our most critical infrastructure. Sometimes guardians wear uniforms and carry weapons. Sometimes they wear hard hats and operate control panels, watching over the engineering marvels that keep our civilization functioning. Marcus Webb had been both kinds of guardian, and in the end, that's all he'd ever wanted to be. Someone who stood watch over the infrastructure that brought water, power, and safety to millions of people who never knew his name. The dam was his responsibility. The cities were his mission. And for 21 years, he'd never let them down. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone whose quiet expertise protected the infrastructure your community depends on without you knowing the threats they were prepared to face? Someone who stood guard over the dams, power plants, and systems that keep our world running? Share their story in the comments below. Thank you for watching The Human Stories. If this story moved you, subscribe to support the channel. We publish stories that matter, stories that remind us that heroes don't always announce themselves, and that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones quietly operating the systems we take for granted. We'll see you in the next story. And remember, you never know who's standing guard over the infrastructure that keeps your lights on and your water flowing.